October 23, 2002, 40 armed Chechen militants stormed the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow during a performance of a popular musical called Nordost. The terrorists took around 900 hostages and were demanding the withdrawal of all Russian forces from Chechnya and an end to the Second Chechen War, threatening to blow up the building, killing everyone inside if their demands were not met. This is the story of the Dubrovka Theater Crisis. The Second Chechen War, which began in 1999, was a conflict between the Russian Federation and the Chechen Republic. The war was triggered by a series of events, including raids by the Chechen militants into the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan and a series of deadly bombings in Russian cities that were attributed to the Chechen terrorists. In response, the Russian government, led by Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, launched a military campaign to regain control over Chechnya. The Second Chechen War was characterized by intense fighting, widespread human rights abuses, and a devastating impact on the civilian population. Over time, the Russian military managed to suppress large-scale separatist resistance, but the conflict evolved into a proactive insurgency marked by sporadic attacks, targeted assassinations, and active terrorism, both in Chechnya and other parts of Russia. The militants involved in the Moscow Theater Crisis wanted the Second Chechen War to end for several reasons. They sought full independence for Chechnya from Russian control, aimed to establish an Islamic state in the region, and wanted to put an end to the violence, destruction, and suffering experienced by the Chechen population. By taking hostages and making their demands public, they hoped for the Russian government to negotiate and eventually withdraw its forces from the region. On October 23, 2002, a crowd gathered at the Dubrovka Theater, excited to experience the mesmerizing musical Nordost. Unbeknown to them, their evening of enjoyment would soon take a chilling twist. During the first act, a bus arrived outside the theater at around 9 p.m., and about 40 armed individuals, both men and women, disembarked. They charged into the theater, firing shots from their AK-47 rifles as they moved through the audience. Once they reached the stage, they announced their presence and stated their demands. The militants announced that they were part of the 29th Division, a group of Chechen rebels, and that the theatergoers are now their hostages. They declared that their actions were specifically aimed at Russia and offered to release any foreign nationalists as long as they could provide a passport as proof. The militants were under the command of Movsar Baryev, a nephew of Arbi Baryev, a notorious Chechen warlord and kidnapper who led an Islamic militant group during the First and Second Chechen War. After the death of his uncle, Movsar took over the leadership of his group. The armed group made their way to the theater's recording room, intending to create a video to publicize their demands for the safe release of the 900 hostages. Movsar demanded a complete withdrawal of all Russian forces from Chechnya, full independence from the Chechen state, and immediate cessation of all airstrikes and air raids in the region. In response, Russian forces did indeed halt all airstrikes and air raids in Chechnya. Movsar further warned that if the demands were not met within a week, they were prepared to kill everyone and destroy the building, as they had brought over 100 kilograms of explosives and were willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause. Once Russian authorities became aware of the situation inside the theater, the security forces swiftly established a perimeter around the theater to isolate the area and prevent the militants from escaping or receiving reinforcements. They also aimed to keep the civilians away from the immediate danger zone. Aware of the vast number of hostages and the significant amount of explosives within the building, authorities realized that attempting an immediate rescue mission would be unfeasible without incurring casualties. The hostages were gathered on the theater's ground floor, constantly monitored by the rebels, and in an act of goodwill, the rebels decided to release some of the hostages that very night. By the end of the following day, they had nearly freed 100 individuals, primarily pregnant women, those with medical issues, and foreign nationalists with valid passports. Olga Romanova, a civilian who felt compelled to take action during the crisis and sought to assist the hostages, decided to make her way to the theater that night. She managed to slip past the police presence outside and around 3:30 a.m. was able to sneak inside the theater. She then attempted to confront the terrorists and was urging the captives to overpower them and resist. However, the militants interpreted her actions as those of an undercover agent and executed her in front of the hostages as a stark warning to others. And in an instant, Olga tragically became the first casualty of the crisis. On October 25th, initial negotiations commenced between the Russian authorities and the hostage takers. The Russian officials established communication channels with the militants to better comprehend their demands and seek potential resolutions. The militants repeated their main request, a complete withdrawal of all Russian forces from Chechnya and an end to all airstrikes and air raids. The Russian authorities acknowledged they have halted artillery strikes and airstrikes as per their demands, but argued that a full military withdrawal from Chechnya within a week would be unobtainable. Additionally, they pointed out that the militants had not identified a specific region they considered as Chechnya, leaving the authorities uncertain about which areas to withdraw from. Frustrated by their response, the militants demanded a meeting with a parliament member named Joseph Kobzon. Following the request to meet with Joseph Kobzon, the hostages also pleaded to Vladimir Putin to meet their captors' demands. Whenever negotiations seemed unfavorable, Movsar would publicly threaten the lives of the hostages. As requested, at 2 p.m., Kobzon and two associates approached and entered the theater to meet with Movsar Baryev. Shortly after their arrival, the militants released a man in his 60s, a Russian woman, and 3 children. They specifically wanted Joseph Kobzon, as he was a recognizable figure in Russia, and involving him in the negotiations could bring more public attention to the hostage crisis and the militants' demands. He also had previous experience in negotiating with hostage takers. He participated in negotiations during the 1995 Budanovsk hostage crisis, which involved Chechen militants led by Shmir Basayev, who seized the hospital in southern Russia. Kobzon's involvement had contributed to the successful release of the hostages. The militants likely saw Kobzon as a potential sympathetic figure who could help mediate between them and the Russian government. The meeting between Movsar and Kobzon was deemed a success, as the militants appeared pleased with its outcome. As a result, they released 39 hostages throughout the day. In addition, the militants made an offer to release another 50 hostages if the current leader of the pro-Moscow Chechen government, Akhmed Kadyrov, would personally come to the theater to negotiate with them. Unfortunately, Kadyrov did not respond to their proposal. After an entire day had passed without any communication, the militants became increasingly agitated with the slow pace of negotiations. They started threatening to start killing the hostages if their demands were not met. Later that night, a hot water pipe bursted, which further angered the militants as they perceived it as a deliberate provocation by the Russian forces. The flooding from the bursted pipe worsened their already poor living conditions on the ground floor of the auditorium. Putin was fully aware of the situation in the theater and had a meeting with the head of SFB, Nikolai Patrushev. During the meeting, they proposed a deal to spare the lives of the militants and for safe passage to another country in exchange for the release of all hostages unharmed. However, the hostages were angry and refused the offer. Later that day, Movsar Baryev gave an interview to a journalist in which he responded to Putin's offer, saying that they had nothing to lose and were prepared to die. He explained that their goal was to end the war and they would not leave until they succeeded in their mission. The militants had also arranged for the Red Cross to bring food, supplies, and render medical attention to the hostages. The hostages continued to call on Putin to meet the captors' demands, with many also calling for an end to the war in Chechnya. When the public learned of this situation, an anti-war protest was organized outside the theater, demanding that Putin withdraw the troops from Chechnya. Later that night, at about 9:50 p.m., about 49 hours after they had stormed the theater, the militants released another 4 hostages. Soon after the hostages were released, a 39-year-old man named Gennady Vlak, just like Olga Romanova, snuck into the theater, bypassing the police presence outside. Gennady was a father and believed his son was captive inside and snuck into the theater out of desperation to see him. Once inside, he demanded the hostage takers to show him his son Roman was alive. They called out to everyone with that name to stand up, and as the man did not see his son standing there, the rebels took him downstairs and executed him. The rebels grew increasingly concerned that an assault on the theater was imminent. They warned the authorities that any attempt to raid the theater would result in a large number of casualties, emphasizing that all the militants, both men and women, were heavily armed. They also mentioned that some women were wearing explosive belts, prepared to detonate at Mavsar's command. This heightened the already tense situation, underscored the potential devastating consequences of any attempt of a rescue operation. Russian forces started making preparations to intervene, as they believed the captors were beginning to execute the hostages. The media reported a plan to retake the building that was scheduled for 3 a.m. that morning. Upon hearing this, the militants who had been closely monitoring the news hastily readied themselves for their final stand. Later that night, around the designated time, 2 Spetsnaz operators were injured by a grenade thrown from the theater as they attempted to approach the building. The militants then began to fire blindly outside the building, but soon realized that the special forces were not actually storming the premises. In reality, the raid on the theater was scheduled for later that morning. Intelligence agencies deliberately leaked misleading information to the media to confuse the rebels, anticipating that they would ease up following the high-stress situation, when they discovered they were not being besieged. The actual operation to storm the theater was planned for 5 a.m. on October 26. By this point, the special forces had assessed the theater's defensive layout and understood that a direct assault would likely lead to catastrophe. They devised a plan to fill the theater with a sedative gas, hoping to incapacitate the rebels, but this also meant sedating all the hostages, which would require precise dosing of the gas, which was deemed extremely difficult. They prepared ambulances and city buses to transport the hundreds of unconscious hostages to the hospital for medical care. At 5 a.m., they shut down the power to the spotlights positioned outside the theater and started pumping the gas into the building's ventilation system. As the militants discovered they were being gassed, panic ensued. They began shouting, "Gas!" However, the rebels had anticipated the possibility of gas being used and came prepared with gas masks. They quickly assumed their positions and started shooting recklessly outside the building. They also instructed the hostages to crouch down in their seats to minimize their chances of being hit by the crossfire. Roughly 30 minutes after the gas was introduced into the ventilation system, the special forces initiated their assault on the theater. About 200 heavily armed and armored operatives stormed the building from various entry points. Unaware that the militants were using gas masks, the special forces were met with intense gunfire, sparking a fierce firefight inside. After about 90 minutes of combat, the special forces finally reached the auditorium, where they found the unconscious hostages and some unconscious militants who did not have gas masks. They proceeded to shoot the unconscious militants, as some of them were still wearing explosive belts, detonators in hand. By 7 a.m., the special forces declared the building secure and began evacuating the unconscious hostages. They started placing them outside the theater on the pavement, awaiting transportation for medical treatment. As the day progressed, the casualty count from the incident continued to rise. By the end of the day, the official death toll reached a staggering 118 hostages, although the specific cause of death was not disclosed. A few days later, 646 hostages remained hospitalized, with 150 in intensive care and 45 in critical condition. The final official death count was 131, with many believing the actual number was higher. The Russian government denied that any of the deaths resulted from the sedative gas, instead placing the blame entirely on the militants, claiming they executed the hostages during the raid. Eventually, details about the cause of death came to light. Moscow's Health Committee Chairman Dr. Andrei Sadolsky stated on October 27th, the day after the siege, that only one of the 131 casualties resulted from a gunshot wound. It became increasingly evident that the gas was the primary cause of death for nearly all the hostages. The public demanded that the Russian government disclose information about the gas used, as they had been extremely secretive about it. The government also faced criticism for the way they evacuated the unconscious hostages. Many hostages were laid on their backs on the freezing cold sidewalks, as medical staff were not permitted to enter the building and properly evacuate them. Information later revealed majority of the hostages died from asphyxiation, as their tongues blocked their airways due to being laid flat on their backs unconscious. Had medical staff been informed about the gas and allowed to evacuate the hostages, many lives could have been saved, significantly reducing the death toll. On June 1, 2007, the official investigation into the incident concluded. The final death count was 171 people, including all 40 Chechen militants. Russian officials eventually admitted that the gas used was an opiate, derivative of fentanyl, though they did not provide specific details. In 2012, studies of clothing samples from that night revealed that the gas was a mixture of carfentanil, an extremely potent opiate sedative used for sedating large animals like elephants, and remifentanil, an anesthetic used in surgeries. Many lives could have been saved if the medical staff had been made aware of the chemical used in the gas, as antidotes to counteract overdoses were widely available at most hospitals. The lack of information ultimately contributed to the high number of casualties in the incident. The Moscow Theater Crisis stands as a tragic example of the devastating consequences that can arise from terrorism and the complexity of the hostage situation. The loss of innocent lives and the dramatic ordeal faced by the hostages during the siege left a lasting impact on the global community. While the Russian government response to the crisis has been criticized for its secrecy and handling the hostages' evacuation, the events serve as a stark reminder of the importance of transparency and effective communication during such high-stakes situations. As we remember the victims of the Moscow Theater Crisis, it is crucial to learn from this tragedy and strive for improved strategies and cooperation to prevent similar incidences in the future.